All of these seemingly ordinary images have something in common. They were all taken down by Chinese internet censors for alluding to the Tiananmen Square massacre. Meanwhile, just across the Taiwan Strait, an inflatable version of Tankman appeared in the middle of Taiwan's Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall on May 21st, just weeks before the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Square massacre. 3 decades ago, this anonymous man stood in front of a convoy of tanks just one night after thousands of protesters had been killed in one of modern China's most violent military crackdowns. Tankman has become a symbol of defiance and peaceful protest around the world, except in China. To understand why China chooses to wipe out such a significant part of its history, we need to dive into what caused the protests in the first place. You're watching Explore Mode, and today we're diving into the Tiananmen Square protests. First, let's get acquainted with these two guys, Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. Mao is widely known for founding the Chinese Communist Party, writing the infamous Little Red Book, the Cultural Revolution. The list goes on. What's relevant to this story, though, was his plan for economic reform, which was meant to help China surpass its Western competitors in the late 50s. The plan was known as the Great Leap Forward. It was supposed to catapult China from a mainly agrarian country to an industrialized powerhouse in a span of 5 years, by separating its population into communes where citizens would focus on achieving certain economic targets. Sounds good, right? Except it wasn't. The leap was anything but great. Not if you're not a fan of catastrophic levels of environmental damage, famine, family separation, and death anyway. Policies for the Great Leap lasted roughly 3 years, but the effects were disastrous. Mao's strategies failed greatly. Roughly 45 million people died as a result of famine and execution punishments if they failed to achieve goals. Mao then tried to fix this huge no-no by starting the Cultural Revolution. But that's a whole other thing. Let's flash forward to China under Deng Xiaoping. Deng took over after Mao's death in the late 70s. His views on economic policies were much more pragmatic, and it was during his rule that China opened to foreign markets. Poverty levels plummeted, China's GDP rose exponentially, and diplomatic relations improved. I mean, look at him here in a visit in the US wearing a silly cowboy hat. Oh, Deng, you goofball. Things were going well. Hooray, right? Well, hooray for a while. In the late 80s, prices in China soared. Inflation went from 7.3% in 1987 to 20% in a single year. On top of that, an economic reform called the dual-track system benefited those in higher economic and political positions, leading to resentment from the general population. So, corruption plus inflation plus economic disparity sounds like the perfect recipe for civil unrest. Which leads us to another guy. Well, the death of this guy, unfortunately, Hu Yaobang. Hu was once a close advisor to Deng and was liked among students for his reformist views, but he was forced to resign after being too lenient when dealing with student protests in 1986 and 1987. Because how dare he appeal to the youth of China? In late April 1989, Hu dies of a heart attack. His passing was the perfect excuse for students to both commemorate the leader as well as air out their discontent with the party. The protests quickly expanded as the students were joined by workers, public officials, professors, and intellectuals, all of whom were calling for economic reform and an end to authoritarianism. As the protests grew in number, Chinese authorities retaliated by publishing an editorial accusing demonstrators of being anti-party and anti-socialist. Unfortunately for them, the letter actually helped students garner even more support. This is where things start to take a turn for the worse. The Chinese government was expecting a visit from then reformist Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in mid-May. At the same time, protesters had gone on a hunger strike and demonstrations were expanding to other cities in the country. When Gorbachev arrived in Beijing, China's Great Hall of the People, where foreign politicians are usually welcome, was, well, filled with people. Hungry people. International media captured the whole shebang, leaving China rightfully embarrassed. Days after, authorities declared martial law, and on June 4th, Chinese military violently took over Tiananmen Square armed with tanks and weapons. They opened fire against the unarmed students and ran over demonstrators with their tanks. 'Cause there's nothing more dangerous than defenseless bike-riding, sign-wielding youth, am I right? China has never revealed an official death toll, but estimates place it in the high thousands. "30 years have passed since, but China's efforts to erase all evidence from this day have increased. According to Reuters, Chinese internet censorship companies are now using AI machine learning as well as voice and image recognition to erase all evidence on the web more accurately. Posts that include related dates, names, and images are all automatically censored. And by this, we mean any type of photo that could even be slightly suggestive of the incident. Researchers at the University of Hong Kong collected and compiled photos that had been posted and taken down between June 1st and June 4th of each year between 2012 and 2018. These include the ones you saw at the beginning of the video. The numbers 4, 89, 46, 8 squared, and any numerical combination in reference to the date of the massacre were also subject to censorship. The list goes on, and will likely continue to get longer in the years to come. Their influence goes beyond borders. This year, Twitter blocked a number of Chinese dissident accounts just days before Tiananmen's anniversary. According to the New York Times, the accounts that were taken down were from human rights lawyers, activists, nationalists, and college students. Twitter claims that they didn't erase the accounts because of pressure from China, but that it was all a mistake. They were actually looking to block CCP bots and instead took down anti-CCP accounts. The company has since apologized, but their actions say a lot about the power of Chinese influence. Now, Tiananmen is remembered in a small museum in Hong Kong called the June 4th Museum, where items that once belonged to victims of the massacre are displayed in their honor. This year, around 180,000 people gathered in Hong Kong's Victoria Park in a candlelit vigil to commemorate the victims of the massacre. Footage of the incident was transmitted on a large screen as demonstrators chanted out the date of the tragic event. The 30th anniversary vigil was the largest the city had ever seen, possibly because its people fear it may be the last chance they will have to openly memorialize this date, as Beijing continues to slowly tighten its grip around the autonomous region's democracy. Unfortunately, their fears are substantiated. Under Beijing's influence, Hong Kong is pushing forward amendments to extradition legislation which would allow local authorities to send individuals arrested in Hong Kong to face trial in China and territories it doesn't have formal extradition deals with, which include Macau and Taiwan. Local government claims the extradition bill will prevent the country from being a safe haven for criminals. But the truth is, the new bill will completely destabilize the one country, two systems structure that has kept Hong Kong as a safe haven true, but for those brave enough to speak against the CCP. Thousands of Hong Kongers have taken to the streets to protest against the bill in the territory's largest demonstration since the 1997 handover to China. Sadly, their pleas are falling on deaf ears. A day after the protests, Hong Kong Chief Executive Carrie Lam announced the law was not going to be withdrawn, telling reporters, "We are duty-bound to address that deficiency," referring to a legal loophole the bill is supposed to fix, adding, "We're doing this out of our clear consciousness and commitment to Hong Kong." On the other hand, human rights groups like Amnesty International have voiced their concern over the bill. Man K-Tam, director of Amnesty International Hong Kong, said, "If enacted, this law would extend the ability of the mainland authorities to target critics, human rights activists, journalists, NGO workers, and anyone else in Hong Kong, much in the same way they do at home." Thank you for watching Explore Mode. If you want to read more about Tiananmen, links to all our sources are in the description box below. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to stay tuned for our next video, where we will explore China's nationwide efforts to monitor their population. But most importantly, remember to leave your explore mode on.